Hey everyone, this is Miss Valentine, and you are watching the Evolution and Biodiversity Notes presentation. Today you're going to be filling in the blanks for the highlighted words, and you can do that either in the Google Doc or you can do it in the handout that I gave you in class. So Earth is really the best planet for life, at least the one that we know of. If you think about the rest of the universe, it's really inhospitable for life. So we have just the right distance from the sun to allow for liquid water. And that means we are in what we call the habitable zone of our star. When we look out into the universe, we're actually looking for planets that are orbiting around their star at just the right distance for liquid water to occur. And that's the thing that you hear when you hear of they found possible life out in the universe far away. Well, really, they haven't necessarily found life on those planets. They have just found a planet in the habitable zone, like we are with our star, the sun. So we have just the right amount of gravitational mass to put us right in this region here. So the habitable zone, the closer you are to the sun, it would evaporate all the water, and if you were too far out, all the water would be frozen. So again, Earth is in just the right place for liquid water, which is necessary for life to evolve and flourish. If you remember from biology class, there was a lot of um, uh, biochemistry related to water, and water is involved in major processes like photosynthesis and cellular respiration. So you can see why liquid water is so important. We have approximately 21% of oxygen gas in the atmosphere, and that what life currently is adapted to here on Earth, and that wasn't always the case, but we are now adapted to that level of oxygen. And we have the ozone layer that protects us from UV rays. Without that UV ray protection, we would all get skin cancer and die, or actually, we probably would have never evolved in the first place because UV light does so much damage to cells. So our planet is really just a great place for biodiversity, and we also could achieve sustainability if we play our cards right. So going back to some of the things you might have learned about in biology class, the origins of life on Earth are starting very small. So we're talking about billions of years of chemical changes going on, followed by biological change to create the variety of species that we know on Earth. And that biological process we know of as evolution. So biological evolution is just changing the genetic makeup of a population, not necessarily an individual, and that makes it more successful to continue on for many generations. So just remember, evolution happens on a population scale, not on an individual scale. Natural selection is a mechanism of evolution, or a way that evolution happens, where a beneficial gene or set of genes is reproduced continuously and then gets passed on to the next generation, while any bad gene or something that is not advantageous gets goes extinct, basically. If the organism is not successful in reproducing and passing on those genes, it eventually will go extinct. So here are the 5 historic mass extinctions, and these have allowed for new life to form. You're going to be listening to a podcast this week called The Fungus Among Us, and it's actually going to talk about the development of life after the extinction of the dinosaurs. And it's got a really interesting take on it that you may not have heard of before. So excited for you to hear that. But these different mass extinctions allowed for new organisms to form and flourish to occupy new niches in the environment. It kind of created an opportunity, if you will, for new life forms to form. Now, we are currently in what's called the 6th mass extinction. So I want you to take a moment to write down what you think the 6th mass extinction is, and you can pause the video at this point to do that. Now, so evolution is very much related to biological diversity. The variety of Earth's species and the genes that we have, the ecosystems where they live, all of that is related back to a long period of time of evolution. These things are actually a resource. We don't often look at living objects as resources, but the ecosystems have services that they provide for us, whether it's food. And then you also have pollination from bees. So there's all sorts of important ecosystem services that we get from the biological diversity that we have. And our current situation on Earth is that we are overusing our resources in such a way that we're destroying biodiversity. And that could have massive consequences for us in the long run. So the components of biodiversity include species diversity, which is just the number of species, the number and different types of species that are in an area. Genetic diversity is just the different types of genes that you have. So genetic diversity within a single species. Ecosystem diversity is just all the different types of ecosystems that we have, and it's really kind of our storage place for all the genetic diversity and species diversity that we have. And it's changing constantly, especially when the climate changes, we see a lot of ecosystem diversity shifting. Functional diversity is the biological and chemical processes, oops, sorry, my picture's in the way, or things that help with the energy flow and the matter cycling needed for the survival of a species in that community. So it's kind of related to, functional diversity is related to those biogeochemical cycles and the energy pyramids and food webs that you studied in the previous chapter. So why is it important? Why do we need biodiversity? It really is capital for us. And capital is just another word for like something financial, something of value, like my house is capital, your car is capital. So we're talking about natural capital. So something that is of value to us as humans, which seems a little selfish, and yeah, it kind of is. But anyway, so biodiversity just biodiversity supplies food, wood, fibers, energy, and medicine for us. It helps us preserve the quality of air and water and the fertility of soils. So the Highlands wetland is a very good example of a place where we have natural capital just from the living things there. It helps us dispose of wastes. It can filter out certain wastes and help improve the soil or the water quality in our area. It helps control pest populations, so fish can eat mosquito eggs, things like that. It preserves Earth's natural capital and helps to sustain life as we know it on Earth. So it is important as raw materials, but also in these services that it provides for us as humans and for our economy in a global sense. So how did we end up with so many species? Well, the answer is evolution. When life began on Earth, it was extremely simple. It was a single-celled organism made up of a few chemicals. So it took billions and billions of years of biological evolution to get to the life forms that we have today. So biological evolution is the process where the Earth's life has changed over time through the changes in the genes of population. And I don't want you to think of evolution as something that has happened in the past. Evolution is still happening continuously. It's happening out in my grass when the dandelions that are really short tend to continue growing because they don't get cut off from the blade of my lawnmower. So I mean, it's happening all around us all the time. So this is just the idea that organisms change over time because of changes in the environment. Now, Charles Darwin is most famous for the idea of natural selection, but Alfred Russel Wallace was another scientist who also proposed the same idea right around the same time. Darwin just published it first, so he gets all the credit. But both of these men were important in the process of, or in proposing the theory of natural selection as a mechanism for evolution to occur. So natural selection, just a review from your biology classes, is saying that all organisms have a struggle and a competition for resources. And because of that struggle, because of that competition, some organisms are going to be better suited to take advantage of those resources than other individuals. If you didn't have that competition, if you don't have that struggle, you don't have evolution. So you have to have a struggle, and then one organism has to have a trait that is positive that helps it pass on to its offspring, that to keep that DNA going into future generations. So the theory of evolution, you have overproduction, so you have many individuals, you have lots of variety in the individuals. In this case, it's different color deer, dark color, light color. And then some individuals no longer survive or reproduce. And then the adaptation happens when the traits of the dark colored deer are passed on to many generations, and it kind of like takes over the population. So this is just an example with fur color. And we see that with brown bears. They evolved into polar bears because polar bears adapted to the polar environment, to the white snow, where they could sneak up on prey. But now we're starting to see a reversal of that because polar bears are no longer invisible in their environment with less ice and snow there. And so the ones that survive are stronger in other ways, or they tend to be darker in color. So that's the overall, and I shouldn't say that is actually happening right now. I'm saying over time, the darker the polar bear is, the more likely it's going to be to survive. So that trait will continue to pass down as we see climate change take hold. So natural selection just makes sure that the traits that are most prevalent are the ones that are advantageous. And so it's actually a good thing for life to be more resilient. So you can see in this picture here, it's showing how certain birds might like to eat green bugs instead of orange ones, and so the orange ones are the ones that survive. So there's different there's different traits that are selected for and selected against, is how you state that. So the tree of life is a result of all of these different adaptations in evolution. So life is categorized into different kingdoms. Bacteria, archaea, protists are kind of like a catch-all category. Most of them are smaller organisms. And then we have our plants, fungi, and animals. So these are the major eukaryotic organisms, kingdoms. And then these are the prokaryotic kingdom. So if you remember, prokaryotes do not have a nucleus and they don't have membrane-bound organelles. So the fossil record tells us a lot about evolution. We know what we know based on the fossils that we found. And what's interesting is that it's only a small percentage of the species that have ever lived. So not all organisms, especially your like soft tissue organisms, are not preserved in the fossil record. So there's a lot of missing pieces, I guess you could say. But we have used our fossil record to establish a timeline of when things existed, what kinds of life forms existed at certain times. You can also find some organism in glacial ice, but that only goes as far back as the most recent ice age. So it is really just creates a timeline for us of what kinds of organisms were living at what times. So the genetic makeup of a population can change. Populations, once again, are the victims of evolution. That's the wrong word. So populations are what do evolution, not individuals. If you ever played Pokemon Go, the individuals would evolve, and that makes it totally confusing. But individuals do not evolve, populations evolve and become genetically different. So it starts with something genetically different in an individual within a population, and that's caused by a mutation normally. The mutations have to be random, or they often are random changes, and it can be inherited by the offspring, which means whatever mutation occurs has to happen in the sex cells. Remember, there's 23 chromosomes in sex cells, so it has to happen in one of those sex cells and be passed on to the offspring. Mutations could occur in other cells as well, but those aren't going to be passed on. So cancer is a form of mutation often that impacts body cells. But the mutations that are advantageous and good for an organism, they have to happen in a sex cell in order to be passed on. So you can see why it might take millions and billions of years for entirely new organisms to develop. So beneficial traits are acted upon through natural selection. So these organisms have a better ability to survive and pass those traits on to their offspring. Adaptation, the term adaptation, is just any inherited trait, so something on the sex cells that is passed on that enables the organism to survive through the process of natural selection. And again, heritable just means it can be passed on to offspring. Differential reproduction means that some organisms are going to leave more offspring than others. And you'll actually hear this concept spoken about in the Fungus Among Us podcast, because some organisms are just better suited to produce a lot more offspring, and that can actually help their chances of building adaptations. I'll leave it here for another moment so you guys can finish copying down. So you can see, just looking at these pictures, the wolf in the top picture, he's a lot darker. And so anything that it's trying to sneak up on, like a hare, is going to know that it's coming. And therefore, it won't survive and pass on those dark fur traits. The white hare is going to have an easier time of surviving in the snow-covered area because it blends in more. It has more camouflage. So it will survive and pass on those genes. So beneficial traits have resulted in what we know of as antibiotic resistance, and it's a form of genetic resistance, which is just basically a population continues to learn to tolerate a certain chemical designed to kill it. So this is what happens when we take a lot of antibiotics into our bodies. Certain bacteria will learn to survive and resist any antibiotics that come along later. And this is something that we may not do on our own. Our doctors could prescribe us antibiotics for bacterial infections. They're usually a little bit more hesitant about it nowadays, now that we know about antibiotic resistance. But the other source of antibiotics that we get a lot is through our food. So farm animals especially get a lot of antibiotics. And so when we eat those animals, we consume that antibiotic material, and that allows bacteria that could enter and harm us to develop a resistance to whatever antibiotic that we're trying to take. So in summary, natural selection acts on individuals. It occurs in populations. And then when the environment changes, the population is either going to adapt to the new conditions, migrate or move away, which we're seeing a lot of human migration right now, adapting to new environmental conditions, and it could become extinct. So basically, the species has to do something when that struggle begins, and it's either going to survive or it's not going to survive. And there's your survival of the fittest. All right, so here is a pit stop. You can pause the video at this point. Explain how new species evolve through the process of natural selection. Now let's talk about some of the myths about evolution that you may have just from an initial learning of evolution in biology class. One myth is that survival of the fittest means survival of the strongest and the toughest, the most aggressive. It's actually a measure of reproductive success, not strength. So an organism has fitness, that's a term you may remember, based on how many organisms it can reproduce. So how many organisms carry its genes into the future. Another myth is that organisms develop traits because they need or want them. Some ancestor had a gene that allows an advantage. So giraffes and long necks, giraffes didn't decide oh, I want my neck to get taller, I'm going to stretch it really hard. No, they got it from an ancestor. They got it from the previous generation, and it just made them more advantageous. It made their ability to survive improve. Another myth is that there's some grand plan of nature which would allow species to become perfectly adapted to the earth, but that is very human-centric way of thinking. We're not evolving towards perfection. Evolution is just happening in all sorts of different ways. It'll happen after humans are no longer on the earth. So evolution is just a continuous process. We are in that process right now. Who knows what our next adaptation is going to be, but evolution is a process. It's not like we're getting to the pinnacle of evolution. So let's talk a little bit about geologic time. This is something else that is mentioned in your chapter 4 in the textbook. So geologic processes demonstrate how long it takes for evolution to take place. So just like it takes a very long time to go from a single cell organism to a multicellular organism, you also have the movement of continents taking place over a very long time. These continental movements played a big role on what animals could live and where they could live. And these geologic events can also isolate certain populations where they might have to develop and evolve in a way that's different than their ancestors or their related organisms left on another geologic landform. So geology plays a huge role in the process of evolution. Now, climate change is playing a huge role in evolution right now. Again, you're going to hear something about that in the podcast that you're listening to this week. Long-term climate changes also had a big impact. So some species, like the dinosaurs, went extinct due to rapid changes. When the asteroid hit the Earth, it filled the sky with clouds of dust and prevented the sunlight from getting through. So that's a catastrophic event. But the climate change that we're going through now is a little bit more gradual than the climate change of previous eras of the mass extinction time periods. Speciation occurs when two species arrive from one. So there's different types. We're going to talk about that in the next slide. But the general process of speciation is that you have one member of a population evolving to the point where they can no longer breed with other members. And I guess individual is not necessarily the best word for that. But if an organism breeds and is not able to create an offspring that can breed, then you have a new species. So, for example, horses and donkeys can breed together to make a mule. So they've got the right chromosome numbers. They're close enough in evolution that they can create offspring, but that offspring, a mule, cannot reproduce. So that makes the donkey and the horse, or I'm sorry, yeah, donkey and the horse, two different species. So this is the measure of speciation. And speciation is kind of fuzzy. I mean, I'm hearing about polar bears being able to breed with brown bears now, and like, what is that creating? So, like, are they actually the same species? So, I asked my colleagues about this last year. I was like, "What's up with speciation? What's up with the polar bears and the brown bears getting together? Like, how do we classify this as speciation?" And they were all saying, "Yeah, it's kind of a gray area with that." But our best definition are things that can no longer breed with one another. Now, usually what happens is you have organisms that get separated geographically. That's called, and that leads to reproductive isolation. So geographically, they're separated either by continental movements or maybe an earthquake or something like that. And that can take many, many generations to create reproductively isolated organisms that can no longer breed. But that geologic separation is what happens first. Now, with the case of extinction, it's forever, although you're starting to hear information about genetically de-extincting organisms, and there's a lot of ethical conversations going on about that. There are cases of endemic species, which are just found in one area, and so they are very vulnerable to extinction. That's an important term to remember. You will see that on various AP questions. The background extinction rate is it's exactly that. It's how much extinction would be happening if organisms like us, humans, were not around. So it's usually at a very low rate. 1 to 5 species a year go extinct just on a regular evolutionary basis. A mass extinction is when you have a huge amount of species, way higher than that low 1 to 5 species a year rate. If 25 to 70% of all species become wiped out, it's considered a mass extinction event. We've had the 5 mass extinctions that we looked at on previous slide. The current mass extinction, the 6th mass extinction caused by humans, is estimated to be 1,000 to 10,000 times the background extinction rate. So we are seeing a lot more species go extinct every year, and that's definitely some something to be concerned about, not only from an ethical standpoint, like we shouldn't kill off these other species, but also from an ecosystem standpoint and ecosystem services. It's not going to be good for us if we lose all these important animals in our ecosystems. So species diversity is important. We've talked before in biology class, when I taught biology class, about how diversity in many ways is important. Genetic diversity, species diversity, ecosystem diversities. The more species richness that you have, the more different types of species you have in an ecosystem, the more stable it is, the more productive it is. And if you have a relative abundance, meaning you have about the same number of trees to deer, or beetles to trees, or if you keep around the same levels, you tend to have more species diversity able to develop. So if it's not a volatile system, you can have more species diversity come into an area. So generally, these areas happen where humans are not involved. We tend to reduce the amount of species in certain areas. Now, the role that each species plays in an ecosystem is called its ecological niche or niche. I've heard it both ways, so you can say it both ways. And all that is the role that the species plays in that ecosystem. So it is the food it eats, it's the temperatures it can tolerate, it's its pattern of living. And there's two different types of niches or organisms that fit into a niche. Generalists have broad niches. A raccoon is a very good example. They can live in many places. They can live in the forest. They can live in an urban environment. That's why we see raccoons in the city a lot. So they will eat all sorts of different things. So they have a very wide, broad niche. Specialists, on the other hand, have more narrow niches. So they have a limited area that they can live, few types of food. The panda bear eats bamboo, so there's one plant that it eats. And then they also have narrow climate regions that they can live in. So we humans are definitely in the generalist range because we eat lots of different things. We can live almost anywhere because of the technology that we've created. But we are definitely in the generalist category. And here we are at our next pit stop. What types of organisms are likely to flourish from the sixth mass extinction event? And what I want you to think about here is your specialists versus your generalists. Talk about that. Go ahead and pause the video while you answer that question. So here's an example of something that could flourish from the sixth mass extinction. In fact, it has survived quite a few mass extinctions. Cockroaches can survive for, I think it's 9 days without their heads until they starve to death. So they are super survivors, you could say, the super generalists. They have high reproductive rates. They can get away from predators easily. So cockroaches are our biggest, most likely to survive candidates in the world. So different types of species are classified based on whether or not they are from an area or not from an area. A native species is one that normally lives and thrives in a certain ecosystem. Now this can change over many, many years. And some native species are often, they're the ones that are more likely to go extinct when a non-native species or an invasive species are introduced to an area. So a non-native species is one that comes into a new ecosystem, and it can include things like dogs and cats. So it's not just like foreign or outside species from other countries. It can also include things that we bring into and plant, crops and domesticated animals. So these non-native species are a danger to the native species that live in an ecosystem. An indicator species is one that provides early warnings of damage to a community. You're going to read this week about amphibians in your textbook. Amphibians are a very important indicator species. So when you hear a lot of frogs and sea salamanders and things like that, it's a good sign that the ecosystem is healthy. The presence of trout indicates water temperature. Birds also can show loss of habitat. Butterflies, the presence of certain plants can be shown by the presence of butterflies. Coal miners used canaries to indicate the presence of dangerous gas. So that you kind of think of it as like the canary in the coal mine. And what they would do is bring the canary down with them. And if they saw the canary die, they knew that there was a dangerous gas in the area. Kind of cruel to the bird, but that's how they saved their own lives, because the amount of gas required to kill that canary was small compared to what would kill humans, but it was just a way to indicate that the human was going to be exposed to potentially hazardous gases. Keystone species is one that has a huge effect on the types and abundances of other species in the ecosystem. So they're kind of like the keystone in a structure. That's the stone that goes at the very top. Wish I had a picture to show you right now. But the keystone species is very essential to the functioning of a community. And oftentimes it can actually be the predators that help regulate the food webs, or pollinators like butterflies or bees. Those are important keystone species that help the entire ecosystem survive. A foundation species plays a major role in shaping communities by changing the habitat to benefit other species. So this is one that might come into an area and help other species with the services that it provides. So beavers and elephants in Africa and beavers building dams actually have an effect of stabilizing an environment. So we call them a foundation species. They help, keep the foundation solid and stable for an ecosystem. So why should we care about all of this? Here's an example of one of the species that we should be looking about in Florida, especially the American alligator. It has no natural predators except for us. And we used to hunt them for sports. And we didn't like them. We were afraid of them eating our kids. But there was a lot of hunting back in the early 1900s, and so they almost went extinct. They play a lot of roles, though, in the ecosystem that we may not have realized. We saw them as a threat, and we wanted to get rid of them. We liked having alligator purses and shoes and things like that. So the gator holes that they create, they hold fresh water when it's dry, and that fresh water is important for other organisms in an ecosystem. It's also, those gator holes are feeding grounds for herons and egrets, and then nesting space for turtles. So you can see this alligator is a keystone species that keeps the entire ecosystem in balance. So when you remove those, other organisms suffer because of it. They were declared threatened in the 1960s, and so now they're making a comeback. So this is a good story in terms of wildlife conservation. Bald eagles is another one, but we'll talk about that later in a different chapter when we talk about biomagnification. So here are the different types of speciation, of evolution that can occur. Divergent evolution is when you have a parent species that through the process of natural selection, or I guess you could call this geographic isolation here, they evolve in different ways. So this is divergent, so they split in two different ways. Convergent evolution is when you have two different parent species, but they actually are adapting based on similar environmental influences. So this would be like butterfly wings and bat wings. So because the environment is the same, it's selecting organisms to create similar structures. The parallel evolution would be your predator and your prey relationship. So the prey evolves to evade the predator, and then the predator evolves to catch that prey, and then it just continues. The two evolve together. So you have two different species evolving at the same time in response to one another. Divergent evolution is when you, like we were saying in this picture here, you start with the same parent species, but as you move away, like down evolution, the longer and longer you go, those structures become different based on the environment that organism is living in. So this is what we would call homologous structures, if you remember that from biology class. But you can see the fingers on a monkey, the whale, the pig, and the bird. They're the same bones. They just are structured different based on whatever environmental niche those organisms filled. So that is divergent evolution. Convergent evolution, like I was saying, it's when you have unrelated species that become more similar because they evolve in similar environments. So bat wings, bird wings, insects wings, These are called analogous structures, if you remember from biology. But these did not have a common ancestor with these structures. They developed the structures because of the environments that they were in. That's convergent evolution. And then parallel evolution is two species evolving in response to one another. So insects and flowering plants are an example, mammals and flowering plants, predators and prey, that's the biggest example, and parasites and hosts. So some hosts might survive the parasites better, and then the parasites get stronger. And so that is another type of coevolution or parallel evolution. All right, we are at the end of our notes here. So you're going to read through the notes again and write a 10-sentence summary about the important points. This was a huge packet of information. So hopefully you guys are able to remember some of this from biology, and it will guide your thinking in environmental science.